One, two, three.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. I'm a guest this evening. His voice you probably know better than his name, and that's quite unusual because what happens sometimes is that people they see a face or they hear a name and they try to put the name to the person and the voice to the person. But your voice, of course, is something that people have become accustomed to. If those of us who are inflicted by listening to the early morning shock radio programs, you'll hear a voice defending us. When I mean us, I mean the community, the people who by and large don't have voices, defending Fela, defending refugees, defending new citizens, and that voice belongs to Phil Kelly, who is my guest this evening. So welcome to Scéalta.
Thank you, Joe.
Can I just remind the listeners and viewers that Scéalta is a joint production between Vulture to Hear and Phil and Fubble, something that's dear to your heart. I know that. So it is fair to say that every time that you kind of turn on the radio in the mornings, you hear you on and you're defending something that needs a voice that needs defending. Are you okay with that? I mean, is that a fair enough description?
Well, you know, I will speak on any platform, Joe, and I'll always speak on any platform to defend the people and the principles and the causes that are dear to me. And that's a privilege to do that. I'm sure a lot of people watching this are probably sick of my voice. We'd like a more diversity of voices, but you know, at any opportunity that I'm given to advance the causes I believe in, then I'll take it.
Tell me a wee bit about how you arrive at being the champion of champions. I mean, what is your background?
Well, at the minute, Joe, I'm chair of Belfast Cuba Support Group, so Belfast-based Cuba Solidarity campaign. But in terms of my interest in internationalism and solidarity work, that's not something particularly unique to me as an individual. It's something that is quite evident in Irish society, and in particular in Belfast as a city. As you know, a short walk from where you're sitting now will take you down to the International Wall, which is an artistic expression of those messages of solidarity with causes throughout the world. And you know, that's a rich tradition within the city, and also in particular to Irish republicanism, and I think is what gives it real momentum and real insight into advancing the cause of social justice here, but also across the world. So I'm not unique in that. And also, how I became politicized is not a particularly interesting story, Joe, because it's one of conformity, and stories of conformity are never that exciting. So from I was lucky enough to be raised by my parents in a very loving household, and everything in their life was guided by empathy, kindness, and love, and that informed their politics. So it was very easy for me to know that their politics was coming from a very good place, to trust their political instincts and go with it. So me and my brother rebelled with our parents, not against them. So I think that the more interesting story, rather than how I came to be politicized, is probably how my parents came to be politicized. You've two individuals there separate of each other who were able to transcend their family's worldview and also the community with which they grew up in, and form their own opinions and their own critiques and become communists, become socialists. And so for me that's the interesting part maybe of my story. So to give you a bit of insight, Joe, my two parents were born not far from each other in East Belfast. My mother's father was a shipyard worker from a long line of shipyard workers, and I think she still has a relative or two still working in the yard. And my father, his father was a boy soldier in the British Army, served out in India, and when the Second World War started, he was recalled into the army at the beginning to go over to England and train new recruits coming into the army, get them ready. But it wasn't long after that he then was sent off, and he served in Burma. He was captured, became a POW, and died on the Burma Railway. So my father was then post-war living in almost destitution with his mother, you know, the only son, and he had to leave education and try and provide for his mother, and he couldn't get a trade in Belfast because he didn't have the right contacts. So you're talking about two very intelligent working class people who started to see the world around them and critique it. And give you an example, of my mother, you know, she had a nauseous reaction to the kind of gospel hall community that surrounded her. And she also, in school, would question why it was so important to learn about English kings and queens, the dates in which they were born and died, but why they were omitting the actual history of the place that she was living in, because she felt there was much more history to learn. This is her critiquing as a kid. My father then, as I say, the poverty that he was plunged into after the death of his father informed his politics, and through reading and educating himself, he became a Marxist, self-read Marxist, a communist. And both of them, even though growing up in kind of East Belfast, were able to form then the next level to that and say, do you know, as citizens living in Ireland, the partition of this country is a crime, and it is clearly causing another level of division as well as the class division. So for me, that was inspiring. Me and my brother were raised, not, you know, the politics wasn't forced on us, but there was 3 pictures that hung on the wall of our house, and it defied the kind of stereotype of Belfast of that time. We didn't have the Pope, and we didn't have King Billy. We had James Connolly, small picture of James Connolly, small picture of Bill Shankly. We weren't very feminist inclusive at this time. And then my brother and I were raised in our cot below this poster, which was my father's poster. So all around us, we had that kind of politics. So it was quite easy step for me and my brother to adopt that outlook.
I think before we get any complaints in to the editorial board, we need to give your brother a name.
Yeah, my brother's Aaron Kelly, and he's the academic one of the 2 brothers.
I was going to ask you that. I mean, I know you've got a very inquisitive mind, and people listen to you on this interview or listen to you on the radio. You're able to collate and to keep, which is no mean feat, information kind of like almost in a file in your head. Academically, were you a clever child? Were you bright? Were you rebellious?
I read a lot. We were surrounded in books. So again, where I grew up, my father would take me and my brother to the library. That was a weekly or fortnightly thing. And one of the things he did was the kids around us weren't signed up to the library, so he would make sure then the kids in our street were signed up for library cards. And whenever we went to the library, another couple of kids would jump into the car with us, because he wanted all kids to start reading, and not reading what he was telling them to read, but knew that just by the power of reading, whether it be novels, whatever, it expands your outlook and the way you see the world. Me, academically, no, I wasn't particularly academic. I hated school. My thing was art. I could draw. My brother was the academic, and still is, and he consumes books very like my father. My father was self-taught in Darwinism and evolution, another break with the kind of community that he grew up in. But my brother's a lecturer over in Edinburgh, and we work together on all our politics. There's no political difference there. And we do that well, and he's heavily involved in the Cuban Solidarity movement. He actually, last November, he went out to Havana for 4 days to talk at an anti-imperialist conference, and he self-taught himself not just Spanish, but Cuban Spanish, so as he could deliver the speech in Cuban Spanish. And that conference was closed by President Miguel Diaz, Raul Castro, and President Maduro of Venezuela. So it was quite a trip, and quite a source of pride for us as a family that he was able to do that.
It's often assumed that a teenager growing up, and sometimes I think this is fed by the media, but it's often assumed or projected that a teenager growing up who has a social conscience or who has an interest in the non-establishment politics is dire and serious and wants to be on demonstrations all the time. Were you that kind of a teenager, or were you just...
No, absolutely not. And I know what you mean, because one of the big things, and I spent most of my life on the fringe left, and one of the things I always felt was it drains the activism away, and it drains the passion away, because ultimately what you're involved in as an activist, what you're involved in as a socialist, is about people and relationships with people. I think too often the fringe left are happy to sit in coffee shops or pubs and discuss their intellectual theory without any connection to the people or community that they seek to represent the needs of. And there's a real difference between those who are involved in actual revolutionary activity and revolutionary politics, whether it be here in Ireland and those across the world, like the work I do with the Cubans, the Venezuelans, the Nicaraguans. The one thing that they get when they come to Belfast is a real feeling of just real solidarity at a human level.
Yeah.
And I would use the example of, and you were there, you know, when we brought the Cuban ambassadors to City Hall to meet then Lord Mayor Deirdre Hargey, and we also brought in the Venezuelan ambassador to meet her. And the effect that Deirdre had as a mayor at a human level, who understood the politics, understood the internationalism, but the way in which she received those people just built a relationship. And to this day, whenever we have guests coming to Belfast, they're always asking, will Deirdre be there? Can we meet Deirdre? And that's important, because if we don't have the human level, the connection to people, then everything we do is pointless. We become talking shops of theory.
You're right. Myself and you coordinated that trip, the first trip with the Cuban ambassador, and then later trips with the Venezuelans and the Nicaraguan ambassador. But it was clear from the engagement, the politics was great, but the friendship was stronger. There was nearly an instant kind of informality about we're friends. We may have a language problem. We may not have all the details of what the politics are in our respective countries, but we're friends. And that just struck me nearly within. And at that stage, I mean, Deirdre was the mayor, as you saying. She was meeting people on a daily basis, but there was something special. And I've seen it repeated with the South African people when they came. There was just that sense of, you know, we're the same. We're friends and we're the same. And I want to ask you about that. I mean, I grew up at a period in Irish politics where there was, of course, the Civil Rights campaign. And parallel to that, there was the Vietnam War and the opposition to the Vietnam War. And so solidarity, both for those in struggle and for those at war, was something that was almost instant. I think the establishment realized that this is a dangerous period. And so we went through a period then that these things they're not our business. It isn't our business what happens in Cuba. It isn't our business what happens around the world. But that's not my experience with you. My experience with you is that and I've heard you speaking on a number of occasions, that when you begin to tell people about Nicaragua, you make it our business. You make it that we need to defend this because ain't anybody else out there. I mean, is that your experience?
Absolutely. Well, you know, every question you ask me, Joe, you would have a more profound understanding of the answer, you know, from your background and your lived experience. So take you as an example. As a proud Irish Republican, the principles that underpin everything that you do, the way you live your life, and the politics you pursue, had you moved to England and lived there, had you have ended up by circumstance in the United States of America, were you born in Guatemala or in the suburbs of Paris, your politics would have been the same, because your politics and your principles transcend borders. It's about social justice. And in terms then of why Cuba, Nicaragua and Venezuela, to use the three examples that I'm primarily focused on, are important, is because those three countries stand on a front line of a global struggle which affects all of us. And they're holding that line, and they're holding it against insurmountable odds. And it's our duty, I think, as people who oppose imperialism, who oppose the domination of poorer nations in the global south, by wealthier nations, the neo-colonialists, to stand with them in their struggle. It doesn't mean that we go there with demands of what we expect the Cuban Revolution to be, or demands of what we expect the Venezuelan Revolution to be, or Nicaragua. They have their own revolutionary movements, and we respect that. It comes with, and our solidarity comes without preconditions. In the same way that it's a two-way process, their solidarity to us, to the struggle in Ireland, came without any preconditions. You know yourself that, you know, Cuba stood with the Irish people as they resisted British rule, and still do, and the Nicaraguans also, and Venezuela too. And that, it's that solidarity without preconditions. We're not there to preach to these people or say what our critique of their movement is. We don't expect it backwards. It's solidarity on a more profound level. And, you know, what is unfolding at the minute in Latin America is a real reinvigorated aggression by the empire, a pushback against what had been, you know, 2 decades of progressive governments taking power, lifting millions out of poverty, and now you see that rollback, the coups, the economic warfare, the sanctions and blockade on Venezuela, the blockade on Cuba, illegal under international law, and the recent coup attempt, an uprising attempt in Nicaragua, all underpinned, and funded by the United States of America, and then the complicity of their partners within the EU, etc. So we have to take a stand against that. And it's important as in Ireland that we take that step, that we stand and reject what our government is doing, the complicity of our government in these regime change attempts.
I'm not sure whether people would be particularly aware of this, or whether they had an inclination of the danger, but really last year and the year prior to it, the Americans almost went, I know there was the attempted coups, and that's, their hand was right on the pistol in that incident, but they almost went in to Venezuela. In fact, Trump was putting out signals to see what the temperature would be like. And I mean, we would be talking about another Iraq type situation. We were talking about, you know, hundreds, thousands dead, all because of the politics of, as you say, American imperialism. And we can see it at work. We can see it in Brazil. We can see it with the pandemic in Brazil, how good America is at that destructive button that they have under their control.
And you're right. I mean, it would make Iraq, I think, look like a picnic. And it's exactly what the region of Latin America doesn't need, and the people of Latin America do not want. So the people of Venezuela made their choice. They made their choice in 1998 when they elected Hugo Chavez. And the coup that we see now didn't start when Juan Guaido declared himself president on the streets of Caracas, a kind of Walter Mitty character. It began the day and hour the Venezuelan people rejected the failure of neoliberalism, which had inflicted a decade of misery in their country, and decided to take a different path, and that was to use the wealth of Venezuela to fund education programs, healthcare, and build millions of social housing for the poorest in that country, to use the wealth for the people's good. But that put them immediately in the crosshairs of the United States of America. And since that moment, Venezuela has been subjected to economic warfare, coup attempts, terrorist attempts. There was a terrorist mercenary incursion earlier this year, which was thwarted. And we now see what they're building up to is to what is called an October event, that America is hoping to provoke a military confrontation. Now, as I've said before, the Venezuelan people, the last thing they need in the middle of a pandemic, global pandemic, is war. But the last thing they will do is kneel and submit to the US empire. So they will fight and they will defend their revolution. And the people in Venezuela, unlike those people in Bolivia, because there was the coup last year against Evo Morales in Bolivia, and the people are unarmed. But in Venezuela, they have local militias, and millions of people are armed and will defend their revolution. And I think America thought, with the sanctions and the blockade on Venezuela, that it was a weak underbelly. It was one step towards moving towards Cuba, and they thought that the government in Venezuela would fall quite quickly, because the hardship is unparalleled. Over 40,000 people have died because of these sanctions. But it didn't, because the people rallied round. They've been resourceful. They've used their ingenuity to try and defend their communities and keep food provided, and stand to defend their government. And they will do that, but they shouldn't have to, because in a world, if we believe in peaceful coexistence, the mighty superpowers of the world shouldn't be inflicting misery on weaker, poorer nations simply because they want to take a different economic and social path of government. And that is outrageous. But you see now the escalation against Venezuela is looking at cutting off diesel shipments, and that will have a devastating effect on agriculture, transport, and really lead to mass starvation. But you don't hear this in the news. When we hear about Venezuela, we hear it as a failure of socialism, whereas the collapse of the Venezuelan economy is a success of aggressive American imperialism, just as they did, as you'll remember, Joe, in the 1970s against Chile, when Henry Kissinger and President Nixon said they would make the Chilean economy scream because they had the audacity to elect a Marxist democratically as their president.
Behind you, of course, we have the iconic poster of Che, another distant Irishman, I suppose. And you go into his own background. And your T-shirt, Vulture Chefe.
Yep.
We welcome refugees. Is that the interpretation? Yeah. Tell me.
That's right. It's an initiative by one of the workers there at the Connolly Centre and Sinn Féin youth member Aidan, and he's basically selling these shirts with all proceeds going to the Refugees Kitchen. So it's an organisation which provides food for refugees both in the UK and in France. So if I can give out his Twitter details here.
Yes, of course, yeah.
If anyone wants a T-shirt, then they can DM him, direct message him, and he can arrange sorting out a shirt for them. So it's at capital HAMILL, then capital OSF. And I'm sure, that'll be out on my Twitter as well if people want to follow me on Twitter, or even the Connolly Centre there itself. But all proceeds going to the Refugee Kitchen, because, again, looking out at the world, we see the conflicts that are caused by imperial actions, by regime change actions, and we see people having to flee their home countries to try and find a better life. And that shouldn't be a fuel of hatred, which we're seeing. A lot of political forces are trying to use that to scapegoat these people and advance their political agenda through that. Whereas what we should be doing is welcoming these people and standing in defence of them.
I think one of the most heartwarming sights, and I live in West Belfast, is the volume of new citizens who you see on a daily basis, who enhance our own culture in terms of their language, their food, their presence, their clothes, their experience. And you see people who are now new citizens of our country. You see them every day. And, those who would have us separated, I think, are fearful of that bond which is reached. And I think you're right when you said earlier on, Irish people get it. They know what it's like to be refugees. They know what it's like to be economic refugees from their own land, or political refugees. I was going to ask you, I know you nearly camp out at Scéalta, and you attend as many events as the organisers do. This year's Scéalta was a reality Scéalta. Did you have withdrawal symptoms?
I did. I missed it. But do you know what I really missed was bringing our friends and comrades, because I feel like I'm in your centre every 2 weeks with a different crowd of people from across the globe. And often they speak at events at the Scéalta, and it's seeing how they react to our city, because it's too often you take for granted, and maybe you don't see the good aspects of your city. I can be a negative person, a pessimist, if you like. But when I bring over the guests, whether they be the Sandinistas, whether they be the Venezuelans or the Cubans, what they see in Belfast, they love. They see themselves represented in the international wall, the welcome they get from the people, the interest and the knowledge within a working class community, the knowledge that people have of struggle. I'll give you one example. We took the Nicaraguan ambassador and the Cuban ambassador to the felons after an event in your centre there. You didn't attend because you don't like the alcohol, Joe.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So
yeah.
the ambassadors were doing a rum tasting of Nicaraguan rum, but even within there, the Nicaraguan ambassador met a man who'd done a mural to the Sandinistas in the 1980s, you know, and understood the struggle straight away. He was talking about, you know, Irish people who went out to Nicaragua at the time, and, you know, just immediately a connection. And then we took another Sandinista comrade to the Andersonstown Social Club, and we were there with an American trade unionist and activist, human rights lawyer, Dan Kovalak, who writes a lot of books about, you know, Venezuela and Nicaragua. A great activist, great guy, and they loved this social club. They couldn't believe it, but a couple of the guys from Ulster Sinn Féin brought over 2 pints of Guinness, and whatever the technology is, I don't know. I'm not a drinker like you, Joe, but they'd emblazoned the top of the pint of Guinness with the FSLN Sandinista flag, and these guys were bowled over with it. They'd never seen anything like it. It was the crowning moment of their trip. They were just like, this city is amazing. So for me, seeing Belfast through the eyes of international guests, and also then seeing the people from my city, how they embrace, how they welcome these people is fantastic. And it sends these people away who are living in difficult times, whose countries are under siege, with, you know, a real feeling that they have support, and that's deeply important.
We started off by saying about your intervention on the early morning radio shows, and I know you spoke recently in Leeds, and I think it's Europe Democracy Conference.
Oh, that was in Sheffield. Yeah.
Sheffield, sorry, in Sheffield.
Right.
Yeah. Is there that interest? Have we maintained the interest in the progression of the peace process in Ireland, or lack of? Did you find that that's something that's still there when you address conferences? Are people still interested about what's going on here? Within
England, it's a bit different. And to be entirely honest with you, even within the left, there's an interest. I mean, I'm a good friend of Chris Williamson, former MP, who would have been to the left of Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn's the independent. He has Irish roots. He has family in Castlewellan roots there, so he's deeply interested in Ireland. And here would be seen as a source of inspiration, but I think the thing that people here have to understand is in England, there's no focus. And even within that I backed Jeremy Corbyn, but even I was turned off in some of the ways that Corbyn used language around a border down the Irish Sea in a way to try and, you know, woo over the DUP or create a split between the DUP and the Tories. And I find that deeply offensive. You know, so there's not this. They've got huge problems in England. England is lurching hugely to the right. There's a huge movement of xenophobic racism. English nationalism's on the rise. So their focus, no, it isn't. And that's, to be brutally honest, it isn't. There's solidarity there in a superficial sense, but it's not up to date with where things are. But it presents political opportunities, because the whole wake of the Brexit fallout, which I was talking about at that time, which was the kind of politics of Northern Ireland. The crux of my speech there was the kind of intransigent struggle over, you know, the future of this place has now infected the UK, because they're now stuck between, you know, two groups of people who have very two different views about where the future of that so-called United Kingdom, I call it the disunited kingdom. But the fallout of Brexit creates huge political opportunity. You see the numbers in Scotland looking towards independence as a means to escape that kind of ever downward trend of Tory rule, and with the way the political landscape is in England, I think that is the correct route, and I think it sharpens minds here in the north as to the urgency of how we need to advance a progressive vision of Irish unity.
I suspect I'm a bit like yourself, in so far as I constantly am listening to radio or television or reading to try and follow political trends globally and more locally, and so you kind of become almost addicted to the news. And there are two periods that I can recall when I refused to listen to the news. I couldn't face it. One was Boris Johnson's election, and the other was Donald Trump's election. I have to say, on one, I stopped listening to news for almost for more than a week actually, and Johnson for probably a week. And I was kind of hurt, saddened, and bewildered when you find that, if, for instance, in England, when you have an imperfect Labour Party by all means, but a better Labour Party than a Tory party, when you find that huge sections of working class people in the most deprived areas of England, in the north of England in particular, vote Tories. Do you ever become disheartened? Do you ever become disheartened when this thing came, this wave of rejection for progressive politics hit you?
Truthfully, yes, absolutely. And it's hard not to be a pessimist. And then also, you know, we have the added ticking clock of kind of climate breakdown. So it's not just, you know, we don't have the millennium to wait for these people to fail and for the glorious revolution to come across the world. There's a ticking clock on this, and we're running out of time. So there's an urgency with which we have to combat these forces. So I think you do have to allow yourself time to be disheartened, but then you have to recognize the reality that life is struggle, and that no matter how far we achieve or what we advance while we're here, that struggle will be carried on by others, and it is endless. And therefore, there's no choice. You either submit and you let these dark forces take hold, or you take your place in the barricade. And one story, because you talked there about you know, my work in Europe. One thing I said at a talk with Yanis Varoufakis, who's very much trying to create a bulwark within Europe against these dark forces, was, I think, always when I'm feeling disheartened or I'm feeling like the odds are insurmountable, I think of an event in Holland called the February Strike. And it was shortly after the German occupation of Holland, and laws started coming in against the Jewish community. And it was clear what these laws were about. And mainly communist-run trade unions with very few Jewish members, has to be said, took it upon themselves to organise a general strike. And it lasted 24 hours before obviously the German forces cracked down. But I always reflect on that, of having the courage, knowing that is not going to work, knowing the storm that you will reap, but taking that stand on principle, because that's what you have to do at that time. And if people can do that in the darkest of moments, or like the White Rose movement within Nazi Germany itself, if people can take those stands, then I think that calls us to sort of reject the feeling of disheartenment and say, regardless, win or lose, we take our place in the barricade. It reminds me of a quote from Che Guevara. He wrote to his son, and he said, if imperialism still exists when you grow up, we'll fight it together. But if we've defeated it, then we'll holiday on the moon. You know, because the society that we can unleash past that, we can enjoy. But the fight is there. It's here today. The forces are rising throughout Europe, throughout Latin America, in the United States itself. And I think, yes, don't underestimate it. Don't lose the fear of it. But what choice do we have? We've no choice. We have to take that stand.
And I think small things can be part of that resistance. And you mentioned the T-shirts, and the T-shirts are very important. Not only are they symbolic, and I'm thinking, for instance, Calais, in that refugee camp that the media called the jungle, without explaining why it's a jungle. Now, when you deprive people of running water, electricity, sanitation, when you raid their camps, when you throw their tents into the sea and you drive jeeps over them, is it any wonder this place is the way that it is? And all of that's the preparation, I suppose, to dehumanize the refugees. And very much like how our Irish people were dehumanized, particularly when they first went to America. You know, there were, and of course you mentioned England, you know, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. No.
Yeah.
So there are small things that we can do.
Of course, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, so that has generated a global kind of outcry against racial injustice. But it also has to call people within North America to realize that the horror story of America predates Trump. Mm-hmm. It's been going on. We talked earlier about imperialist actions, the amount of people bombed and killed by drone strikes, by US aggression across the world. So it calls us to start joining the dots. And I know that the former mayor, Sinn Féin mayor, got into a bit of trouble, and it defended him on the media because he was saying, we understand what police brutality is like, and there was people saying, no, you're trying to co-opt this. He wasn't. He was exhibiting a very real level of solidarity, which says, I come from a community that's been brutalized police. I understand what it's like. It's not the same, but we support you. And to give you another example of Cuba and Cuba's commitment to that, because the fight against racism isn't a couple of months old. It didn't start when George Floyd was murdered on the streets of America. It's been ongoing since the very formation of the United States of America, that kind of racial injustice. But Cuba took in Black Power activists who were fugitives from the United States and gave them political asylum. And in the 1990s, under Bill Clinton administration, there was talks about easing the blockade. And one of the conditions the Americans came up with was, well, we want these people back to face justice. And Cuba, who could have had the embargo lifted or lessened, said, no, that's not something that we can negotiate. And there was fear among some of those people who are, have claimed political asylum in Cuba, that when the Obama administration followed the policy of, warmer relations or less heated relations with Cuba and easing, that they would be pawns in that. And they were reassured, despite a lot of speculation, that's not going to happen. And it's that commitment that it's what we talked about earlier. There's principles that are not negotiable and bonds of solidarity that are not negotiable. So you'll remember as well, Joe, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, liberals across the world wanted to welcome him, as a new figure, and they wanted to sanitize the anti-apartheid struggle. They wanted to gloss over that this was an armed struggle against oppression, a hard fight. Also, that Cuba played a major role in. But when Mandela was pushed on that, he made the point, your enemies are not my enemies. So, again, from an Irish perspective, I think that's something that we have to do, because there'll be a lot of pressure as we move towards a border poll, we move towards a new Ireland to clean off certain rough edges, from our American friends, to say, you need to disassociate yourselves, but that's exactly what we shouldn't be doing. We need to have the confidence to say, and I think we do. And, when you mentioned Labour earlier, the destruction of the Corbyn project, a lot of it had to do with anti-Semitism smears, which I think was kind of dog whistle Islamophobia, because I don't think many people in England are really worried about anti-Semitism. They were voting against Labour because they thought, well, if Corbyn hates the Jewish community, must be pro-Islam. And I think it was kind of a clever move to dog whistle Islamophobia. The good thing, and the thing I've said, the activists in England, I was talking about this only yesterday to some Labour activists, it wouldn't work in Ireland. Can you imagine somebody trying to create a division between Irish republicanism and the Palestinian cause? It wouldn't happen.
No.
It couldn't gain traction. And that's because there's a deeper relationship there. It's one with deep roots, and it's unequivocal and it's unbreakable, and that's important. And that, when we talk about, internationalism and the way we look at the world, it doesn't mean that we ignore the politics here. It informs us. We are educated by it. That's what FAIL is about, is learning from other people and them learning from us. So, whenever I'm talking to young Republicans and socialists, the point I make is look at Cuba, a tiny island nation off the coast of an empire that freed itself and built a new society, a society created by those people, free from bondage and standing on its own feet in its own sovereignty on its own terms. That's an example for us in Ireland, to look at and take inspiration from, because we're, we come from a place where we fought an empire just across a short piece of sea, We didn't yet create the new society that Connolly dreamt of, but that's the challenge of ongoing struggle. That's about taking up the beacon from Connolly and his comrades and carrying it forward, which is what, again, your centre is a great example of. You
mentioned, and I think it is important that we understand that a lot of the colonial oppression and imperialist oppression, particularly that's emanating from America, didn't begin 4 years ago with Donald Trump. It's something that's inherent in that system. But however, I think he's an extremely dangerous individual, surrounded by even more dangerous cadres of people who are promoting and selling his ideas. And I suppose I'm a bit like you. I watch every opportunity to get analysis of his potential election successes or his failures or whatever it may be. Would you be worried in the awful event, which is a possibility and maybe it's a likelihood, that he's re-elected? He has a stated commitment that he will not only strengthen the embargoes on Cuba, but flatten Cuba, but end the democracy in Cuba. Would you be worried that, and is there any sign, but would you be worried primarily that this threat will be carried out?
Certainly, yeah, they will intensify, and that they are set on that course. And part of the ongoing, it's a chessboard. So the actions in Bolivia was about removing the weak link. Bolivia, they knew they could oust Morales. The people aren't armed, and they can quickly consolidate power. Then Venezuela and Nicaragua are next in the list, and there's already moves in motion to attack the next general election in Nicaragua and attack the next election in Venezuela and undermine democracy. There's this new idea of saying a country isn't democratic because we won't stand in the elections. We're going to sit out the elections because they know they won't win. So Cuba, yes, is absolutely in the crosshairs, but Cuba has been in the crosshairs again since Fidel Castro pronounced the Declaration of Havana, and it will never be forgiven by the United States for that. So am I fearful for the future? No. Cuba will stand, and it will stand regardless of the odds that it faces, regardless of the hardship it's subjected to. The Cuban people are well-educated people. They know the source of their problems, and they know it lies not within their own country, but the external threat 90 miles off their coast, a global superpower that feels so threatened by an island of 11.5 million people in the Caribbean that it has to have a decade-long blockade of that island, and it's subject them to an ongoing terrorist and mercenary campaign and spend millions in propaganda. So am I fearful for the Cuban people? No, because I have absolute faith in their ability to stand through it. 4 more years of Trump will be horrendous, be a nightmare. Many people will die. But the problem is the American horror story is bigger than Trump. And what you have is, while Trump has moved the Republican Party to the extreme right, to areas where the Tea Party couldn't have imagined they would sail on the political map, but the Democrats are then following over on the political map to take up that leftover ground on the right. So you've now got declarations by Biden saying Trump is too easy on Venezuela. We need to do more. We need to do that. So my comrades in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba will face difficulties regardless of who inhabits the White House, because the criminal enterprise is bigger than the individual that sits in the White House. That said, yeah, I'll feel particularly dark in mood when if Trump is elected. It probably looks like he may well be.
That's not what I wanted to hear, that he probably may well be, because everything you've said, I share. And it's sometimes easy to label all this the property of one lunatic when you're dealing with a more endemic difficulty. So all of that is all of that. And that's the business, and that's what you do, and that's what you breathe and you eat. How do you relax? What do you do when your head's not in that political competition?
It's never out of it, but as much as politics is scary, and we look at the world in a scary. The people that we work with and you work with inspire me, and as much as I'm a pessimist, I have to say at times I get real inspiration from people like yourself, the colleagues that you work with, and also the people I work with around the world. But I'm lucky. I've got a great family. My mother's still alive, still a good source of critique and how to understand the world. She's seen it all before, and the bond that I have with my brother is very, very close. And then I've got 3 great children who I'm trying to subtly move to to my political leanings. So I'm always inspired when they come home from school and they mention something about me. But they tell me to shut up at times in the house. Why do you keep asking us about history as the only subject? You never ask us about maths. Would be one when they come out of school. Because I'm constantly asking, what did you learn about in history? What did you touch on?
Have you became your father?
No, he wasn't like me.
That relationship?
No, he wasn't a political bore. He was a man of great humour and great wit. I at times am a political bore, and I have to check it. But my wife's a good sounding board for that as well. And other family members.
Do you like music? Do you socialise? Do you?
No, I'm one of those Spartan, boring socialists you talked about, Joe.
I'm very sorry. I'm so like you. Yeah, we're absolutely serious all the time.
Yeah, we're the Spartan. Yeah, no. I love music. I love traveling Ireland. It's something that I'd like to do more of. We done that a lot of when we were kids, and we would spend a lot of time in Donegal and stuff. So we're not long back from there. It's always a good way to recharge. I like sport. As I mentioned earlier, Shankly was a big persona in our house, and we're all diehard Liverpool fans. And my father would have had to support a team with "You'll Never Walk Alone" as their anthem. That clearly spoke to him. And obviously Liverpool are having a great time as well. We're also, 2 teams that were our teams were Celtic and Liverpool. But where I grew up, we could never understand. My brother and I would always ask for Celtic. We always get Liverpool tops. We always ask for a Celtic top for Christmas or birthday, and never came. My parents always indulged us, very indulgent of us, but these Celtic tops never, took us to a certain age to realise self-preservation.
Yeah, wouldn't have been a good idea. You mentioned earlier on that you are, and I know you are, you're a prolific reader. What about writing? Do you write? Have you any plans to write?
I've written a bit now, but I don't like as much as I'm a pontificator. I'm very happy to talk, but I feel when you write something, it needs to be much more worthy than the throwaway lines that I can indulge in on radio or TV. So, but there is one book within the Connolly Library. It's a collection of short articles on 1916 and Scottish perspectives. And my brother, he's a lecturer in Edinburgh University. So myself and him wrote a short article about Connolly, about the kind of the liberal revisionism you get of 1916 and how they attack Connolly or try and view 1916 as some kind of aberration or something wrong and shouldn't have happened. And we attack that in an article in defense of Connolly. So that's there in the library. So that'd be one of the few things I've written. But I'm lazy as well, Joe, and I'm not focused enough yet to write, but I need to. I'm under pressure to.
Well, I think if we take the critique of all the stuff that you are involved in, you're perhaps been a little bit harsh when you describe yourself as lazy. Because I know from listening to friends and comrades and people like yourselves that when you're not speaking, you're thinking. So you're constantly in that kind of, and politicos, I think, get a bad press. Our version of politicos get a bad press because it isn't easy to listen to the news without kicking the television set or pushing the radio over or going out into the garden and cursing over the fence at your neighbour. So there's always that volume of stuff that's going on. And I'm glad to hear you saying that you appreciate Donegal and the break and all of that. I think that you need to do that. You need to recharge the battery. You need to kind of get a perspective of stuff. And one of the benefits of this program is to have people like yourself on the program because you do get a different a different view, a different angle of stuff. So with 5 minutes left, we've been talking for almost an hour. So plans for the future. What are your...
Okay. Well, COVID has been a nightmare for us because, you know, the Cuban Solidarity work we've been engaged in has been very active over the last couple of years, and constantly bringing guests and creating events about educating. And you said about me writing stuff, but we've been trying to facilitate bringing voices that people don't hear to Belfast to educate people as to what is happening beyond the propaganda. So it's been a frustrating couple of months in that terms of our work has been sort of hit the buffers. We've had to move to social media to try and keep the message going. But the big thing, what I would say in Ireland, is we need to change the government.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the people that I support and represent, the people of Ireland voted for change in the last election, and they've been denied it. And what I would like to see is a government take place in Ireland that stands on principles and changes Irish foreign policy and is willing to stand up and have uncomfortable conversations with the EU and the United States. And as we said, your enemies are not our enemies, to have those difficult conversations. On a lower level to that, the COVID outbreak. So in the midst of this pandemic, we mentioned earlier Venezuela, that the United States has tightened sanctions and the blockade. It's committed acts of piracy against Venezuela to stop them getting aid and medical supplies into the country in the middle of a global pandemic, when the World Health Organization has been explicit, saying the only way you can defeat a global pandemic is through international solidarity. And in the same time, the blockade on Cuba has tightened, and they're trying to use the pandemic as a means of regime change. Now, the Americans who are suffering under this horrible virus, dying in huge numbers, can't access healthcare, their government is spending even more money to create propaganda to smear Cuba's international medical missions. So one thing I'd like people here to be aware of and to maybe get involved in is an understanding of the HENRY REEVE Medical Brigade in Cuba. So this was set up, Joe, in 2005 as a response to Hurricane Katrina. So Fidel Castro set out a volunteer medical brigade with supplies ready to fly to the disaster zone in the United States and offer emergency disaster aid of no cost. And the American government rejected it. And the American government didn't do much because the people most affected by that hurricane were black working class Americans. And the Cubans were ready to go there and do that without, no agenda, no preconditions, nothing to do with the embargo. We will do what needs to be done. But what they done in response was say, right, we're going to use this. So I think Cuba has something like over 50,000 doctors serving throughout the world in over 60 countries. But if we focus on the work of the HENRY REEVE Brigade in relation to this pandemic, when this broke out in Wuhan, the Chinese requested assistance from the Cubans because despite the crippling blockade on Cuba, Cuban scientists have developed world-beating antiviral technology, and they're very proficient at developing cures and treatments for difficult diseases, as you've seen when they went out during the Ebola crisis in West Africa. So they went to Wuhan, the epicenter of this outbreak, and one of the first effective drugs in the treatment of COVID-19 was a Cuban-developed drug called interferon B. And the Cuban doctors out there were trying to get a knowledge of it because it was very, very clear from early that this thing was going to become a global pandemic. So again, then as more countries suffered outbreaks, they requested Cuban help, and the HENRY REEVE Brigade would send volunteers to those places. Now, Cuba has served throughout the global south, Africa, Asia, Latin America, for many, many years. But to me, one of the big things that punctured the lies and the smears of US propaganda was when Cuban doctors arrived in the supposedly wealthy country of Italy. So Italy was caught hugely unaware and became the global epicenter then of COVID once it came to Europe. And Lombardy, you'll remember the images, Joe, coffins lined up and the military coming in, ICU wards that couldn't cope, doctors and nursing staff falling victim to this terrible virus. Well, we've spoken to some of the Cuban doctors and some of those that went to Italy, and they were approached, and, are you willing to volunteer? And the Cuban authorities were saying, we know very, very little about this virus. we would urge young volunteers, because the evidence is the older you are, the more problematic it can be. And these people volunteered without hesitation. They went away then in Cuba and they read everything that they could about this disease because no one understood it. Were they scared? Yes, they told us we were frightened, but we were doing this because it was the right thing to do. They weren't asking anything for it. It was about serving humanity. And they boarded a plane, they flew to Italy, and they went straight to the front line in that fight against the global pandemic. And their mission, simple and also deeply frightening: save as many lives as you can. And they worked tirelessly until the virus was brought under control in Italy. And they're still now sending brigades wherever they're asked, at the same time as America spreading propaganda, against them. And I want to give you one example, and anyone that's heard me speak on Cuba will have heard this story before. But this, I think, is the most profound example of what Cuba stands for. And I think people in the West don't get it. The depth of commitment to international solidarity and serving the needs of humanity wherever those needs come from. So in 2006, 2007, in Bolivia, Evo Morales was in power. Bolivia, not with much health infrastructure, asked Cuban medical missions to come to the country and perform basic surgeries to help peasant rural populations. And one of the main things that Cuban doctors can do in impoverished countries is cataract operations. Very simple operation, but if you think of living in abject poverty, if you're almost blind or blind due to cataracts, your poverty then becomes life-threatening, it becomes even worse. And one of the medical missions, a man brought his elderly father to this medical mission who had severe cataracts. He couldn't see his grandchildren, he couldn't watch a football match, life-limiting cataracts, and the Cubans returned and restored his eyesight. And the man's son wrote a letter to the Cuban authorities, and he praised them, he thanked them, and he said, I also want you to know that my father is called Mario Turan. And Mario Turan is the man who, when Che Guevara was captured in Bolivia, was the young Bolivian army soldier who volunteered to execute him, kill him, murder him, who walked into the room and Che's last words, shoot card, the man was shaking, shoot card, you only kill a man. And Cuba's response to that was, it doesn't matter. That's we give treatment wherever it is needed to whoever needs it, without question, without preconditions. That's the principles that Che gave his life for, and that's the principles that underpins Cuba as a country. And that's why me as an individual, Joe, till my dying day, and my brother and the comrades that we work with will stand with the Cuban people in defense of their revolution.
On those very poignant words, our time is up. I want to thank you for being a wonderful guest. I'm going to tell your brother, you keep referring to him as your brother and you won't give him a name. That's another story. And maybe the next time we're on the air, I'll have Aaron on and we'll talk about it. But anyway, thank you. It's been a wonderful hour. It's went very quickly. I enjoyed your company. Thank you.
Thank you.